Welcome to Bladebound Saga. My name is Daniel, otherwise known as Rice Combo Online.
I'm AJ, also known as Professor Bulk, and like you said, we are Bladebound Saga. Today, we're going to be talking about GM tips. So if you've ever wanted to run your own game of Daggerheart, be the DM for once, be that person for your friends to run the game. This is the video for you. So without further ado, let's get started.
Welcome to Bladebound Saga.
There. So, like I said, today we're going to be talking about GM tips and running your first game. Firstly, though, Daniel, why are you a good source for GM tips?
Yeah, so I think I've been playing tabletop RPGs now for the greater part of a decade, and with Daggerheart specifically, I kind of fell in love with it last year when it was still in closed beta. And when once it hit open beta, I was just playing games left, right, and center, doing a lot of the how to learn how to play Daggerheart. And I think right now, if I've done all my numbers and looking it back, I'm at 77 games run of Daggerheart, which I think is probably a little excessive for a game that hasn't been out yet. But I've just fallen in love with the game. And I think when it comes to a lot of the people in the community, they're always asking for questions. And I feel like I'm always answering those questions. So I think let's just put it in video form. So that way I don't have to answer those questions every single time. I can just bring people to a video.
Yeah, so this is going to be kind of a question and answer sort of format, and with 77 games under his belt, I feel like we can trust what he has to say about this.
Hopefully,
and we've played a lot together. We from way back for years playing D&D. You've been our GM for that. I mean, for 8 years about now. What was the biggest, I guess, shift you would say coming from D&D, or maybe just coming from a different tabletop RPG into Daggerheart?
So I think this kind of goes to the different D&D or GM styles in terms of like rules versus written versus rules as intended. I think you can definitely, even in the D&D setting, be a rules as intended versus rules as written. And even in Daggerheart, the same kind of applies. But I think the one big shift when it comes to GMing in Daggerheart versus GMing in D&D is that there's a philosophy of collaboration. And what I mean by that is right at the quick start guide, one of the very first things that it asks you, rather than what other D&D modules or one-shots have, is you describe the setting, but then you also have the players describe the setting. So you ask, what do you take note about the woods? And then when you make it to the tavern, the GM gives you a little bit of information about the sign that you see, but then as the doors open, you ask the players what catches your eye. And so a lot of it is a lot of yes and. So I think in comparison to D&D, where the GM crafts a lot of the world, is kind of the more the expectation. In Daggerheart, as the GM, I'm relying on my players to come up with something really interesting. And oftentimes it ends up being better than what I would have thought would have been in the tavern or the area that they're currently in. So I think that philosophy of letting your players tell you what they see is kind of the big thing.
Yeah, and I agree. Even from a player standpoint, I feel like it brings everyone together, and that sort of trust is being built between players and GM, from the GM allowing the players to basically help create in their world, which I really love, and I think Daggerheart does a great job of putting that into practice.
Yeah.
So what does your prep look like for a session of Daggerheart?
So honestly, and I think some people get a little, maybe it might be the anxiety or the stress of learning a new system, but I don't think there's a whole lot. Now, obviously, as a GM, you're learning a new set of rules, and as the person who's abdicating and making sure that they're following all the rules of a given system, there is going to be a little bit more prep up front because you're teaching your players at the same time, hey, this is how armor works in the system, and then this is how the health thresholds work if you're used to something with just a general hit points, and especially with like action economy. Obviously, you have to like learn the rules, but in terms of prepping for the session, once you have the rules down, there really isn't much of a difference. I would say one thing that Daggerheart does a little bit better than D&D is you don't have to prep nearly as much in terms of every minute detail, because kind of like what we talked about before, with a lot of yes and, is I'm relying on the players to come up with that scenario, that scene, and then it ends up kind of just being more improv-y. So if I think you'll probably struggle a little bit if improv is maybe one of your weaker spots, but if improv is like what you thrive on, which at least for me that's one of my favorite parts of any tabletop RPG, I'd say that it's made my prep a lot less in comparison to other systems like Dungeons and Dragons.
And to kind of piggyback off of that question, how do you balance combat encounters with like player level? Do you have a system or a rhyme or reason to that? Are you using any pre-made, adventures to help kind of figure out that balance? Just, as someone who wants to write their own one shot, how would you tell them, hey, if you want a good battle encounter, this is how you can help build that, so it's not too easy but also doesn't just completely kill your party?
Yeah, I think the first thing is, firstly, let's address the fact that Dungeons and Dragons CR system is nonsense. It doesn't make any sense at all.
Exactly, yeah.
So that whole system, I've always thrown out the window. I kind of just throw whatever I feel makes the most sense. And then obviously I'm not going to throw in like a dragon at a level 1 party, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think in Daggerheart, it's kind of a similar thing. But I think the nice thing that it does with Daggerheart versus D&D is they have tiers of play. So you have tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, or tier 1, 2, and 3. With those tiers, depending on the tier that your players are at. So if they're at level 1, they're in tier 1. If they're at level 2 through 4, they're tier 2. They're at level 5 through 7, they're tier 3. And then 8 through 10 is tier 4. Daggerheart stats all of their monsters out in the various tiers. So you kind of just pick like a monster that makes sense for that tier and then throw that towards your players. And the nice thing about it too is they also classify the monsters. So you have solo monsters that you typically just throw one big solo monster at, but then you have other monsters like a supportive monster, which is meant to support a bruiser monster, which is more beefy. Then you have the minions who kind of just have 1 health and you kind of just whack at them and they deal damage. And each monster has their own subtype, and there's a little bit of stuff in the game that kind of helps you. Hey, if you're doing this encounter, you should probably have a mix of these subtypes together to really make a challenging and interesting encounter. But there's also environments, which also throw another thing in there, and a lot of that is just learning a little bit more of the rules. But the guide, at least the manuscript that we have, does a really good job of telling you how to build an encounter. So I think that helps a lot more than the kind of arbitrary system that D&D has, and some other tabletop RPGs have with like a CR system.
Gotcha. Okay. As someone who hasn't read through the GM part of the manuscript, that helps a lot. I didn't realize all of that was in there. So
yeah. Ooh, another really cool thing too is they also teach you how to do monsters on the fly. So if you're at tier 1, a tier 1 enemy should have X amount of thresholds, or thresholds from, I think it's like 4 to 8 for their major. And then it goes from like 14 to 20 for their severe threshold. And then it also tells you if you're on tier 1, you deal 1d dice of damage. If you're at tier 4, you deal d x amount of damage. And then so if you're fighting a big boss, that's going to be a d12. But if it's like a small minion, it should be a d4 or d6. So depending on how much damage you want to deal, you up the dice. But then you also, depending on the tier of play you're at, you also raise and lower the dice.
Gotcha. Okay.
So helps a lot even on the fly.
Yeah, for sure. So I think one of the biggest changes that a lot of people have when they first come to Daggerheart from other TTRPGs is, especially in combat, is no initiative order. How do you as a GM keep the pacing at the right spot where it's not just one person trying to take over or, no one not doing anything? And just how do you balance like your time and the player's time when it comes to combat without initiative?
So this is my favorite part of Daggerheart in terms of like mechanically what I really love, because of the fact that I really don't like combat as much in Dungeons and Dragons just because I feel like it's so slow. That being said, I've had great combat encounters in Dungeons and Dragons and other systems as well. But I think the first thing is really just taking initiative yourself. So when combat starts or when a bad guy approaches, you immediately narrate what's going on. And then what Spencer has actually said in some of the live streams is you put the spotlight on that moment and see who reacts to it. So say we're taking a combat where you want to run into a combat, but your players are kind of dragging. Maybe they're going to attack, maybe they're not. This is where you have that resource like fear that says, you can spend it and then make it where the players kind of get a little bit on edge by making the enemies notice them. And so you're spending the resource that you've been given, that you've been acquiring, to kind of take action. And so by this time, once the combat starts, you probably have a handful of various fear. And then so if the players take a little bit longer in the fight, use fear, just jump forward, take an attack to attack a PC. If they're kind of being a little hasty. Now, obviously, if they're learning mechanics, kind of be a little bit easier on them. For like one example would be, if you're running into a combat, what you as a GM should narrate is something like, the skeleton lord takes a great sword to guardian player. Then you roll to hit and take damage, or roll to hit and do damage. Then the guardian player marks the armor. And then the next piece of the narration would be, so as the blood drips from your wound, the guardian player, how do you react? And then at that point, you assume that the guardian player attacks and activates an ability. So say he activates Unstoppable. So going Unstoppable, you push the skeleton lord back with an attack of your own. And then you look at the other players. So who comes, or which one of you comes to the aid of the guardian? And so kind of with that model, you run the game like spotlighting a scene of a movie, where you focus on wherever the action's at. And the nice thing is your players can always interrupt you. It's like, say the bard wants to cast one of his, or use a kind of like a buffing spell or a debuffing spell to slow the enemy. They can certainly do that at any point. You're just the one who's pointing and shifting the camera between all of your players. And so I think as you do that and you're shifting the action, you as the GM kind of make it a lot more cinematic, and then kind of just pick up on your players. Hopefully, if you're playing online, you have webcam, so you can kind of see if someone's trying to say something. If you're playing in person, you're kind of looking at body language, so there's a little bit of feedback that you can get from players directly. But for the most part, you're maneuvering it, and I think that makes it move a lot faster, because someone always wants to do something, and there's no waiting around for your turn to come up in initiative.
Yeah, and I've even noticed in some games where you will point out a player, maybe they haven't done anything in a while, to basically just pan over to them and say, "Hey, is there anything that your character wants to do in this moment as well?" So it sounds like the GM, like you said, makes it cinematic, where they kind of point spotlights at different places, but also the players are still welcome to take that spotlight.
Oh yeah,
when if they have the right timing or opportunity to do that. So
oh yeah.
Is there anything that Daggerheart makes easy? Like, is there anything that Daggerheart makes GMing easier? I don't know if I asked that right, but Daggerheart being the narrative it is this system easier to GM than other systems that you have ran?
Yes, because it fits my style. That being said, it might not fit other people's styles, and that's perfectly fine. I think that's the really great spot in terms of where we are in the tabletop RPG community, where there are so many tabletop RPGs out there that you'll find one that matches your style. If it's not Dungeons and Dragons, if it's not Daggerheart, if it's not DC-20 or Pathfinder, any of the other ones, you'll find one. But I think one thing that makes Daggerheart stand out in terms of GMing making it easier is it does make it where I don't have to make the players figure out how their characters interact, because one of the first things we do is like connection questions, which I do now, not just at the beginning of every, I don't just do it at the beginning of every campaign. I do it at the beginning of every session, because I think there's been time that's passed between the players that they've definitely had conversations. And so connection questions kind of builds a little bit of, connections and story between each individual player, and kind of forging those relationships. So I think that's one thing that Daggerheart makes easy for me as a GM, because it makes me not have to figure out or find the work that I think the player should do, because we're all doing it at the table.
Yeah, 100%. And we've talked about this. I think every video we mentioned that connection questions is our favorite part about 100%. Daggerheart, and I can't say it enough how much I agree with that.
Yeah.
So say you have a newer player, maybe they're new to TTRPGs in general, and maybe they don't know how to improv a NPC, or what do they see, or an environment. How would you what suggestions would you give to a person like that, where they're just not sure how to be part of, build part of the world? Maybe they don't want to step on your toes, or maybe they're just don't have that skill or that experience yet.
Yeah. I think one thing is fleshing it out. Take some time to really think about what you want to play, but then also ask your players. I think that's the one thing that we've talked about already a couple times in the video is, if you don't know, just ask your players. Maybe they know. They likely have ideas about what they're going to see. And so if you enter into a part of the world and ask them, what do you see in the forest? Or what is different about the water here? they'll give you something. And hopefully with that, you can kind of stretch a little bit of improv. And like over time, the improv side of things ends up being a lot easier. But having those things to kind of call back to, your players will remember what they make up better than you. And so it also eliminates the problem of like always having to recap some things. So when it comes to like stuff for new players or new GMs specifically, I would say don't. Daggerheart does a really good job of making sure the pressure is not always on you, and you can alleviate that pressure by just asking your players at times. And so you can eliminate some prep, but then also just have some fun with whatever they make up, whether it's a gator dragonfly that just is now a running joke between every one of my tables that I run. So, but yeah.
Yeah, improv, I feel like just like any other skill is something that's developed. You can become better at improv, and yeah, I just, I think that some things just come with time and comfortability. It's one of those things I feel like as some newer GMs can kind of cower back from, is that they kind of are afraid to be out there. Be out there. You're the GM. You can do almost whatever you want, within reason.
Yeah.
But yeah, and guys, I think that's all the questions I have as far as GM tips. I think we learned a lot. The great thing is we're going to be able to see all these tips put into action.
Yeah, because upcoming, AJ, you're going to run your first game of Daggerheart.
Yeah.
So I think we decided that on October 19th, so in just about 15 days, AJ is going to take the tips that I gave you guys, but also gave him, and put them into action. And we're going to run a community game. So if you're interested in that, sign up is going to be in the Discord. It's going to be through Start Playing like we do with every one of our games. It is going to be free as long as you are within the community. It's going to be locked out only to people who have access to Discord, as a Start Playing link will only be accessible to them. But if you're interested in it, if you have any questions, please leave a comment. If you have any questions about being a GM, leave them down below. I want to know what you want to know so I can help. And then, as always, like, comment, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.
Yep. See ya.
All right. See y'all.
From ink and steel, stories are forged. We are Blade Bound Saga.